Yeah, yeah, I think we're live on both platforms. Okay. Um, Good evening to everyone who's tuned in. Today's discussion is based on the theme of entrepreneurship and marginalized social identities in India. And joining me are two eminent speakers. Allow me to introduce you to them. Professor Amit Basole is Professor of Economics and Head Center for Sustainable Employment at Azim Premji University. Dr. Angarika Rakshit is a research fellow at the Center for Sustainable Employment, Azim Premji University. A very warm welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
So, let me begin with my first question. When it comes to enterprise ownership, in what manner do caste based exclusions manifest in the Indian economy? Could you explain the three distinct stages of exclusion that you detail in your paper for EPW?
Yeah. Um, so, the like I was saying in the previous link as well. So the way we have approached this in our paper is to look at uh, representation and ownership of enterprises from the perspective of exclusion and unfavorable inclusions. Where by exclusion we mean that you don't own an enterprise at all, whereas unfavorable inclusion means that you are concentrated in ownership of enterprises which are not economically valuable for some reason, right? And this is relevant in the case of India because a large number of enterprises in India are very small enterprises which often operate from within the households and are subsistence oriented in nature, right? So the first stage of exclusion that we identify is that marginalized identity groups do not become owners of any kind, right? Whether it's small, large, medium, whatever, but they don't become owners of any kind. So they are underrepresented in ownership of enterprises in general. The second stage of exclusion occurs when they do become owners, but they don't become owners of commercial enterprises. By commercial, we mean which are purely commercial. And we make a distinction here between enterprises which operate from within the household. The census identifies them as commercial come residential, right? So they serve both purposes. And there are other enterprises where the structure is purely commercial in nature, right? So the second stage of exclusion is when you are excluded from the ownership of these purely commercial enterprises, right? And finally, the third stage of exclusion occurs when even if you become the owner of a commercial enterprise, you tend to be concentrated in the smaller commercial enterprises. So you are excluded from the ownership of enterprises which are large among the commercial. And these large enterprises are also likely to be the more valuable enterprises, which is what we would normally understand by entrepreneurship, right? That these are large scale enterprises, high value, which gives some economic power by virtue of owning them, right? So that's our last stage of exclusion.
Right. Right. Professor Busoli, would you like to add any introductory comments?
No, not at this time. We'll proceed.
Okay. Okay, great. What are some of the major barriers to the expansion of these businesses that are faced by the marginalized caste groups?
I can come in. So I think this is not something that we have ourselves looked at in this paper, but from the review of literature and reading what other people have wrote about this, we figured that there are quite a few of these channels. And one most prominent which comes up repeatedly is perhaps access to credit and access to even institutional credit. So it's not even if you exclude where it's not institutional, there is overt forms of discrimination. Even in access to institutional credit, there are barriers for marginalized caste groups to acquire credit for business, right? And this is sort of both because these identity groups are ones who are historically assetless and landless, so you don't have the collateral to get a loan. That is one reason why credit might be a barrier. But there are also other papers which have shown that there is active form of discrimination in institutional credit, where entrepreneurs from marginalized caste groups are likely to get a lower value of loan and also have a lesser probability of getting a loan, right? Besides this, we have also seen that there are dominant caste networks operating within business communities, where the existing dominant business community sort of prevents entry of any outsider into that community, right? Which you can say is an active form of discrimination, right, into the business community. Yeah, Amit, you can add to that.
Yeah, no, I just exactly what you were just saying. The role of social networks is very important, and again, this is something that we haven't looked at in this paper. So, one way to look at the paper that we are discussing is that what we are seeing in the data, the economic census data that we analyze, is the outcome of a whole range of processes that are going on at the background. So, the question you asked is really about what are those things, and we should remind ourselves, as Angarika said right at the beginning, is that overall enterprises tend to be small in India, and small subsistence oriented enterprises find it very hard to grow. So those barriers to growth are shared by anybody who is operating a small enterprise, not necessarily from a marginalized caste group or anything like that.
Sure.
But they get compounded when you talk about such identities, because there are usual problems of credit and infrastructural issues, but then social networks are very important. And um, a person from a dominant caste group or a business community, an established one, or something like that, or even somebody who has gotten an education beyond a certain point, and again, education is related to discrimination at the back of it, right? They may avail of certain networks by virtue of who they are, which are not going to be available to other people. So, and those networks are going to be essential not only for credit, but for finding markets, finding inputs, like technology and its transfer, a whole range of things that matter for businesses. So they're all being combined, together to see the kind of outcome that we are reporting.
Right, right. And it's access to both financial as well as social capital that really helps you climb that ladder and expand your business. And we'll come to the scale aspect of it in a bit. But when it comes to it, there's also this very interesting aspect that you cover, the occurrence of the intersectionality of caste and religion, which you point out in your study, shows some striking disparities. Could you elaborate on the same?
Right. So what we see very clearly when we do a caste only analysis is that the others caste category, which is basically the upper caste group, is the one which shows overrepresentation and increasing overrepresentation as size of the commercial enterprises increase, right? So within the commercial enterprises, so they are basically overrepresented at every stage. So they are overrepresented in any ownership of enterprises, but when you look into what type of enterprises, then they are overrepresented in commercial ones. Within the commercial, if you see what size enterprises they are overrepresented in, so they are overrepresented in all enterprises beyond 1% enterprises. Right? So that if you leave aside own account enterprises, others caste category is overrepresented in all commercial enterprises, but more so in the larger ones. Right? But when we intersect caste with religion, we see something very interesting. We see that as we move from enterprise ownership to commercial and subsistence, others, Muslims, are no longer overrepresented in commercial enterprises. Within the commercial enterprises, as we look at different size categories of enterprises, Muslim others are not overrepresented in larger commercial enterprises. So this others' caste dominance in ownership of commercial large enterprises are mostly driven by, are almost purely driven by non-Muslim other caste categories, right? So this caste privilege does not seem to operate for Muslims when it comes to enterprise ownership. So, yeah, Amit, if you want to add to this.
Um, so, no, I think the point is already made. We just maybe say that what the economic census data allows you to do because it's a large database, right? It's infrequent, so viewers would perhaps not know that the last one we have is actually 2013. So the conversation we are having is based on data from 2013, and a lot may have changed in 10 years, but we don't know that because the next round of the economic census, the data is not out yet. I believe the census has been carried out, but because the census has a large sample, you can do some slices that are harder to do with sample surveys. And among those are these minority within minority type of slices. So if you want to ask the question, how do Muslim scheduled castes fare in anything compared to Hindu scheduled castes, or Muslim OBCs compared to Hindu OBCs, or Muslim upper caste compared to Hindu upper caste? These are important questions to ask because we know that caste operates, as you said, intersectionally with religion. What we mean by that is that a Muslim person from a scheduled caste background may feel an exclusion or oppression that comes from caste, being scheduled caste, but also by virtue of being Muslim. So there are two things going on here at the same time. And getting at that is very important, but data usually doesn't allow us to do that. So what the census has allowed us to do is some of that slice, not a lot, but some of it. And what you'll see from the pictures in the paper is that the Muslim, representation index line is always going to lie below the other religions, right? And
Right.
in other religions, there are Hindus, Christians, everybody else who are more privileged when it comes to business activities compared to Muslims. So they don't face the same exclusions in the same way, even though they may be minorities. They may be talking of Christians as well and Parsis and so on, but they don't face the same kind of exclusion. So Muslim scheduled castes are more underrepresented than other religion scheduled castes. Muslim other backward castes are more underrepresented than other religions and so forth. That's the kind of double exclusion that we're reporting in the paper.
Right. So there are no binaries when it comes to exclusion. It can exist at multiple levels and it can exist at the same level in multiple ways, if we're really looking at it, which is what you refer to in your paper as vertical as well as horizontal social mobility. Um,
So just if I add to that, I think there's something interesting we observed between OBC and others when we do this classification by religion. Right? So in case of religion, we see that the Muslim identity dominates, right, in
sure.
underrepresentation.
Sure.
But when we do this for OBCs, we see that the non-Muslim identity doesn't seem to be able to overcome the caste disadvantage, right? So even non-Muslim OBCs remain underrepresented, right? So it operates in different dynamics, right? So
Absolutely. Um, how does the size of an enterprise correlate with the economic power and vertical mobility for marginalized caste groups?
So I briefly, I think, said this in the beginning that
Yeah.
the larger the enterprise, the more it represents your power to mobilize economic resources in the
Right.
like in the country. So if being an entrepreneur, it's expected that you have the ability to mobilize some resources, but being an entrepreneur of a large commercial enterprise really signifies what that power, how much more that power is. Right? Like I was saying, if you're a subsistence own account worker just operating from within your household, there is not much difference between an entrepreneur and a worker. Those lines are very fuzzy. Right? In that case, it's hard to say how much power do you really have as an entrepreneur, right? But if you are controlling a large factory, like a large, really, you're the owner of a large factory, you're able to employ workers, you're able to acquire raw material, you're able to source other kinds of investments, and you're able to grow in size. That does represent some power that you have as an economic agent, of course, but also as a person in a society.
Yeah.
Yeah, Amit might want to add to that.
No, so I'll just go back to the vertical horizontal question that was raised earlier, and again in the context of this question. That just to clarify, I mean it's not a big part of the paper, but it is alluded to that when we talk about caste-based structures in Indian society, right? People might find exits from the kind of containers that they've been put in by the system in different ways. And the easy thing is horizontal, which is that let's say your caste based occupation is sweeper, sanitation worker. You take the kind of very clear caste segregated example that we have in India with scheduled caste. Then an exit from that is of course good in the sense that you're breaking the caste association, but you may find work just as construction worker. A construction worker can come from many castes, but construction work and daily wage work is not exactly desirable kind of work. So there's a
Exactly.
certain kind of mobility there, which is breaking the caste norms and structures, but not resulting in a whole lot of material improvement. Vertical mobility is where you're actually breaking out of it and improving standard of living, and in our case, actually improving economic power. So imagine that you are a leather worker, you run your own leather unit. That's your traditional caste occupation.
Right.
Now, a kind of horizontal mobility is, well, maybe you leave leather work, but you run a petty retail store. That's not vastly more remunerative, but it is no longer your caste marker. So there's something that has changed.
Right.
However, now imagine that the same person has the ownership of a large factory. In fact, it could even be a leather factory with 50 workers or 100 workers. That's a different scenario. They are members of the community that command a certain kind of power and respect, which they didn't earlier, right? So that's the kind of horizontality and verticality that we are referring to.
Yeah,
Again,
yeah.
we're not doing a lot with it, but we're just talking.
Absolutely. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Could you also explain the pattern of exclusion that of marginalized identity groups, especially when it comes to ownership of, continuing with the point Professor Basole just made, ownership of high value enterprises? Do you believe that this is the reason that we observe their over representation in subsistence based enterprises?
Yeah, so I think it's partly that when you become an entrepreneur and you can't become owner of a big commercial enterprise, what is left for you is this subsistence kind of entrepreneurship, right?
Right.
But one thing that also struck me when we were doing this is that we do this is it's I should say that this is not something absolutely new we are saying. I think we know that marginalized caste owners are few, right? What we do, I think, is to systematically break it down into how do these exclusions occur. And what we found there is that we know that, say, SC entrepreneurs are concentrated in small enterprises. So, the enterprise size of the enterprise that they own tend to be smaller. But
Right.
when we break this down into any enterprise into subsistence versus commercial and then size, what we find is that they are underrepresented even in the small commercial enterprises, right? So even in as small as two worker enterprise, which is purely commercial in nature, SCs are underrepresented. So yes, they're not represented in the larger ones is definitely a point, but that large starts at as low as two. Right? That's also something that I think is concerning. Now, whether this is the only reason they are in subsistence, I think that's harder to sort of argue that in the sense that they are in subsistence for a number of reasons, uh, and lack of economic opportunity outside of this subsistence sector is perhaps why they are in either subsistence entrepreneurship or in subsistence workers, work, right, of any kind. Yeah, do you want to add?
No.
Yeah. So, can you also explain these two terms that you employ in your study, which is identity-based penalty and identity-based premium? How did you calculate the identity-based penalty and the identity-based premium in your research? And what are some of the implications of the same?
Right. So we actually wanted to make a comparison between what the situation is now and what it should be. Right? If
Yes.
there is, if nothing goes wrong, if everything is fair, what is it that it should be? And this is, of course, we do this in terms of representation, saying that how marginalized identity groups are underrepresented in ownership. But we also wanted to sort of understand this as economists in value terms, right? What does it mean in terms of the value of output that you control? So which is why we use this identity, penalty, and premium concept. And what an identity, penalty, or premium in our paper means is that what is the difference between the value of output that an identity group would actually controls and what it would have controlled if it was not underrepresented in large commercial enterprises, right? So there is a counterfactual value of GVA that would be controlled by an identity group if it was not underrepresented, right? And this, if this is, if the value is, if you are underrepresented, then your actual value would be lower than this counterfactual value, which is what we call an identity penalty. And if you are overrepresented, the actual value you control would be higher than this counterfactual of what you should control. And that we call an identity premium. So, and I think just as we look at representation in two segments of commercial enterprises and commercial enterprises of larger size, similarly, our penalty and premium also come from these two sources. So, do you become commercial enterprise? Are you underrepresented in commercial enterprises, and what is the loss that's coming from there from being underrepresented in commercial enterprise of any size? And then there's an additional penalty if you are underrepresented in the larger enterprises of commercial nature, which are also the high value enterprises. So that's our two components of the penalty premium. And I think in terms of implications, what we find is that it's a sizable chunk of total proprietary so our entire analysis is for proprietary entrepreneurship, private proprietary entrepreneurship. And what we find is that of the total GVA produced in the manufacturing sector by this proprietary entrepreneurship segment, this penalty premium is 1/4 of it. So 1/4 of total GVA produced in proprietary manufacturing is going to an identity group, which should ideally is going to the privileged identity group, which are overrepresented in entrepreneurship, which should ideally, if there was no sort of disparity in representation, gone to a number of marginalized identity groups.
Right. Coming to my next question, what are some of the pathways that policymakers can adopt to ensure the scaling up of entrepreneurial ventures of those belonging to marginalized caste groups?
Yeah, so of course, this is where all of the analysis really leads to. Now, they can divide this question up into two parts. One, as we mentioned earlier, India in general has a problem of scale in enterprises. So there's always the question of what should be the policy approach to generally scaling up,
Yeah.
enable enterprises to scale up regardless of the ownership. And then there's the further question of how do you specifically target policies towards owners from marginalized backgrounds to enable them to overcome the particular barriers that they face. So there are the general barriers and then the particular barriers. And a lot of people have written about how MSMEs should be supported in various ways and so on. Of course, what we have seen in the last few years is unfortunately quite the reverse, which is that a series of shocks has actually um, impacted the MSME sector differentially more. Starting with demonetization and then GST and then COVID, we've had about 5-6 years of multiple shocks that have really hurt the sector very badly, including, of course, marginalized groups. This is not something we do in the paper, but a lot has been written about it. Now, so the policy element has one, the general scale up, the other marginalized groups, but also the other is how do you specifically help them with these shocks and then a long-term vision, right? So these are all components of a policy framework that is needed. Now, there is the perennial issue that Angarika raised of credit. We do know that we still haven't solved for this, although digital payments have increased, bank accounts have increased. So, in general, the infrastructure that is needed to now push credit successfully has improved dramatically in the last few years. But banks, therefore, do not automatically become willing to lend just because the structure exists. You still have to solve for some very basic issues in the Indian banking financial system, which exclude entrepreneurs who are not coming with a certain social capital.
Yes.
So we need a policy focus on how do you do that. There are certain other kinds of levers that are available to the government. For example, we very briefly allude in the paper to the fact that procurement can work in your favor. So the government is a big procurer, right? It buys a lot of um, goods and services from businesses, and there is an established procurement policy for MSMEs, where a certain amount of government procurement is supposed to come from medium, small, and micro enterprises, and within that there can be a quota or some kind of a system for enterprises that are owned by marginalized groups.
Right.
So you should be, as a Dalit entrepreneur, as an OBC entrepreneur, you should be able to avail of a policy where you can sell to the government with priority, and that gives you a kind of an assured market that gives you confidence to invest and grow and so forth. So that's another kind of policy lever that is available. Uh, and so beyond credit and procurement, there is a set of issues that mix up basically, if you look at where enterprises are located, again, you will find that marginalized entrepreneurs operate out of geographies that are underserved infrastructurally. So there's an intersection of a general infrastructural push and an enterprise growth push. So if your business is in that part of town that has bad electricity, bad roads, and bad water supply and bad internet, and of course, we also know that that will also be the locality which is overrepresented with disadvantaged groups. So your business is going to be where you live, and it's going to be where the services are poor. So that means that there's a policy alignment between improving infrastructure in underserved areas and enabling enterprises in those areas to grow better as well. So there are any number of these kinds of things that one can talk about, and it's not like we are saying them for the first time. They've been well known for a long time. But perhaps what is needed, and this could be the big lesson from the study, what is needed is that you need to bring a specifically caste, religion, identity-based lens to promotion of entrepreneurship and growth of enterprises. So whatever policy you're imagining, that is for MSME growth, for scaling up, and so on, needs to have a very clear understanding that within this policy framework, we have these subset of policies that are aimed to reduce this thing. And if you look at one of the charts in our paper, you'll see clearly how the underrepresentation is growing with size. And the policy target is that we have to move that line up. We have to reduce that underrepresentation, and over 10 years, 20 years, here's how these policies will enable us to do that.
Very well put. Dr. Rakshit, do you want to add any points to that? Any concluding remarks?
I think that that is very comprehensive for sure.
Right. So perhaps I can end this session with the quote from your article itself, which says, um, more sustained and comprehensive efforts are required to address multiple forms of exclusion in factor as well as product markets that restrict the entry of individuals from disadvantaged social groups into entrepreneurial activities, as well as prevent them from expanding in scale. Apart from their intrinsic value, from the perspective of social justice, these efforts should be seen as part and parcel of India's policy focus on economic growth and structural change, since neither of the two can be sustained for long without the participation of the majority. With that, I'd like to take a note of thanks to the audience who's been patiently listening in. You can access this article on the EPW website. I'd also like to request you, as a side note, to subscribe to us and support us on social media. Thank you once again to our speakers for patiently